In the summer of 2015, the streets of Athens fell silent. Banks had shut their doors. Cash withdrawals were rationed. Pensions were frozen. And people who had once lived ordinary European lives suddenly found themselves waiting in endless lines at ATMs, hoping the machines wouldn't run out. Among them was Nicholas Stavros, a retired schoolteacher, who had spent his life believing in the stability of his country. He looked at the blank screen of the ATM and whispered, "We gave the world democracy, and now we can't even take out our own money." Greece, the cradle of philosophy, democracy, and currency itself, was now negotiating its survival with international lenders. This wasn't ancient history. This was modern Europe, a nation inside the Eurozone, a proud member of the European Union, operating with one of the world's most stable currencies. And yet, it was standing on the verge of default, like an empire in its final days. How did this happen? How does a developed nation, backed by global institutions and bound to a currency shared with Germany and France, end up begging for bailout after bailout? And why should it matter to anyone outside Greece, to someone who's never set foot in Athens? Because what happened here wasn't just a local crisis. It was a modern case study in how the global financial system works, how debt becomes a political weapon, and how quickly sovereignty can dissolve when money runs out. Let's rewind. The seeds of collapse had been planted long before the headlines began. When Greece joined the euro in 2001, it gained access to cheap borrowing it had never known before. For decades, the nation had struggled with high debt and high deficits, but the euro changed everything. Markets believed the risk was shared, that Greek bonds were as safe as German ones. Suddenly, borrowing became effortless. And borrow they did. Public spending soared. Infrastructure projects boomed. Salaries in the public sector rose rapidly. Roads were built, airports modernized, and hope returned. But beneath the surface, the old problems never went away. Corruption thrived. Tax evasion spread like wildfire. Bureaucracy bloated. Government revenues couldn't keep up with expenses. And underneath the optimism of the 2000s, the debt kept piling up, quietly, relentlessly, dangerously. By 2008, the storm that would shatter Greece was already forming. When the global financial crisis struck and Lehman Brothers collapsed, it sent shockwaves through the world's markets. Inside the Ministry of Finance in Athens, Andreas Vasilis, a senior economic advisor, stared at a spreadsheet filled with red numbers. He turned to his colleague and muttered, "We can't hide this anymore." Greece had been running one of the largest deficits in the Eurozone. The numbers simply didn't add up. And when investors began to look closer, what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. In late 2009, the truth finally surfaced. The government had been underreporting its deficit for years. The real figure was closer to 15% of GDP, far higher than what European Union rules allowed. Confidence vanished overnight. Borrowing costs skyrocketed. Greece was locked out of the bond markets. The country was effectively bankrupt. And in 2010, there was no choice left but to turn to the European Union and the International Monetary Fund for help. The first bailout arrived, 110 billion euros, but it came with a heavy price. Austerity, massive spending cuts, tax hikes, pension reforms, labor market overhauls. These measures were meant to reduce the deficit and restore investor confidence. Instead, they strangled the economy. Shops closed. Construction halted. Families lost homes. GDP plummeted. Unemployment soared past 27%. And youth unemployment hit an unbearable 60%. Public services crumbled. Hospitals ran short of supplies. In the streets, protests erupted almost daily. Teachers, nurses, factory workers, everyone demanding answers, but getting only silence and statistics in return. And all the while, the debt, the very thing these bailouts were meant to fix, kept growing. Because here was the cruel irony, as Andreas often said to his team. When an economy shrinks, the debt doesn't vanish. It becomes heavier. By 2012, Greece needed another rescue, a second bailout worth 130 billion euros. This time, private bondholders were forced to accept losses in what economists called a haircut, though for ordinary citizens, it felt more like an amputation. The crisis dragged on for years. Each bailout came with more austerity, more conditions, and less hope. By 2015, after years of pain, frustration, and broken promises, the people were ready to fight back. And that's when a new government, led by a defiant voice named Alexis Karis, rose to power. He promised to end the suffering, to reject the harsh terms of Europe's creditors, and to give the people a choice. The summer of 2015 was tense. Athens had turned into a city of arguments, in cafes, on buses, in living rooms. Everyone was talking about one thing: the referendum. Prime Minister Alexis Karis stood before a sea of supporters in Syntagma Square, the Greek flag waving behind him, his voice cutting through the warm night air. "They want us to surrender," he shouted. "They want us to accept humiliation as policy. On Sunday, we will say no." The crowd roared, thousands of voices chanting Oxy, Oxy, no, no. A cry that echoed through the same streets where democracy had once been born. The question was simple but devastating. Would Greece accept the new bailout terms offered by the European creditors, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, or reject them and risk complete collapse? Inside his small apartment, Maria Theodora, a nurse whose salary had been cut in half, sat with her elderly father, Nicholas Stavros. "What will you vote, Barbara?" she asked quietly. Nicholas sighed, staring at the television where foreign leaders debated Greece's fate. "I will vote no," he said softly, "because there is nothing left for them to take." When the results came in, Greece had spoken, and it wasn't a whisper. 61% voted no. The world was stunned. A small nation had stood up against the might of Europe's financial powers. But the victory was short-lived. Days later, Prime Minister Karis walked into a closed meeting in Brussels. The cameras were off. The tone was cold. Europe's leaders gave him an ultimatum: accept an even harsher bailout or face expulsion from the Eurozone. Leaving the euro, returning to the drachma, would have meant instant economic collapse. Banks were already on the brink, savings frozen, and the government was days away from running out of money. So, despite the people's vote, Karis signed the deal. The new bailout came with deeper cuts, more taxes, and even stricter oversight. When he returned home, protesters filled the streets again, not in celebration, but in betrayal. A woman shouted through tears, "You asked us to say no, and you said yes." But Karis had no choice. The alternative was chaos, and Greece had already come too close to the edge. Economic sovereignty, at least for now, was gone. Decisions about the nation's taxes, spending, and budgets were no longer made in Athens, but in offices across Brussels, Frankfurt, and Washington. The new rulers had no armies. They carried no flags. They were called the Troika, and they now controlled Greece's fate. By the end of 2015, the streets of Athens had quieted, not because peace had returned, but because exhaustion had won. The protests faded. The chants dissolved. And people went back to surviving. Inside a dimly lit cafe near Ammonia Square, Nicholas Stavros stirred his coffee slowly. "We are free," he said bitterly, "but we no longer make our own choices." He wasn't wrong. What had happened to Greece wasn't a new phenomenon. The mechanics were ancient, as old as civilization itself. Debt had always been a weapon, a tool of power, a silent way to conquer without war. Historians like Dr. Elias Markos, who lectured at the University of Athens, began to draw striking parallels. He told his students, "Look to the past. The same script has played out before." In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire faced a similar fate. After decades of reckless borrowing and repeated defaults, European creditors took control of its customs revenues through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, an institution designed to ensure that money flowed back to lenders, not to the empire itself. It was, as Dr. Markos explained, financial colonization. And Greece wasn't the first modern victim of it. In the 1870s, Egypt had done the same, borrowing heavily to modernize, to build railways, to expand the Suez Canal. When it could no longer pay, Britain and France stepped in, not just as creditors, but as managers. They didn't need to invade. They simply took control of the finances. Flags still flew. Kings still reigned. But the real power had shifted. The creditors ran the show. That's exactly what happened to Greece in the 2010s. No soldiers. No occupation. Just signatures, spreadsheets, and conditions. The Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF became a kind of shadow government. They decided what could be spent, what had to be cut, and how quickly debts would be repaid. For ordinary Greeks, the consequences were devastating. Pensions were slashed to a fraction. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies. Thousands of small businesses collapsed. And through it all, the debt barely moved. By the time the country stabilized, it carried a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 160%. The economy had survived, but it was smaller, weaker, slower. The price of survival had been a decade of lost growth. Years had passed. The crisis that once dominated headlines had faded from the world's attention, but its scars remained visible everywhere. In empty shops, in reduced pensions, in the quiet resignation of people who had once dreamed bigger. On a cool evening, Dr. Elias Marco stood before his students and drew a single line across the board. "This," he said, "is the lesson Greece gave the world." He pointed to a map showing nations scattered across continents: Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Argentina. "Every one of them," he said, "is now facing what we once faced, a crisis of debt, dependency, and sovereignty." The story was familiar: heavy borrowing in good times, panic when markets turned, and then the long, humiliating dance with external creditors. The names changed, but the pattern remained the same. Even advanced nations were not immune. Italy carried one of the Eurozone's highest debt burdens. Japan's public debt had soared past 250% of GDP. And across the Atlantic, the United States, armed with the privilege of printing the world's reserve currency, had passed $34 trillion in debt. Large economies could delay the reckoning, but not escape it. Dr. Marcos turned back to his students. "Greece's tragedy was never about numbers," he said softly. "It was about control, or the loss of it. When a nation cannot print its own money, when it cannot devalue its currency, when it depends entirely on outsiders for financing, it is no longer fully in charge of its destiny. Its policy space shrinks. Its freedom fades." That was the heart of Greece's fall. Debt had made the country wealthy once, powerful, ambitious, confident, but it had also made it fragile. Debt is invisible when times are good. It feels painless, even harmless. But when confidence vanishes, debt becomes a chain, and the lenders become decision-makers. For ordinary people, the lesson is no different. Debt narrows choice. It trades freedom for convenience. Whether in a household or a nation, the more dependent you become on borrowed money, the less control you have when the rules change. As the class ended, the lights dimmed, and Dr. Marcos looked out the window toward the Parthenon, glowing faintly against the night sky. "The fall of Greece," he whispered, "was not a conquest of armies. It was the quiet surrender of sovereignty. And as history had proven time and again, empires do not always fall with swords and fire. Sometimes, they fall with debt and signatures. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And somewhere, in the world's next financial storm, another modern nation will face the same test, just as Greece once did."